couple of years where I taught Hebrew as well as English. I'm right now teaching Hebrew at like a congregational school, so most of my experience is actually with high school students. So, and they tend to kind of need a lot of visuals and distractions, so I've gotten a bunch of YouTube videos for you guys, and like, you're medical students, I'm assuming you have way longer attention spans, but so if it's a little too, if you want to cut the YouTube videos, let me know, but I threw them in just to pander to the usual crowd. So basically my background is largely in teaching English literature, but since living in Israel for about 5 years, I sort of started falling in love with the Hebrew language, and I've kind of discovered a passion for teaching and also learning Hebrew. So I hope to be able to share that passion with you here. Feel free to ask questions. I have to need to be open with you guys. Hebrew isn't my first language. Hebrew is my second, third language, really. Although I did spend quite a bit of time there, and I'd say I'm close to fluent. I'm not completely fluent, so if there are any minor grammatical errors, hopefully you guys won't know about them. But anybody here is like a secret Hebrew expert, then please forgive me in advance. Also, my pronunciation, I'm going to try to pronounce as well as I can, but I have brought a few clips of native Hebrew speakers that I'm going to play for you, just so you get a bit of a better sense of the accent and also the pace of the speech. Now we're going to learn a bunch of conversational phrases and a bunch of words, and we'll practice, in pairs and in small groups, kind of trying to put those together. And we're going to take it slow, but a couple things. First of all, any Hebrew that you know when you go to Israel is great. Basically, most Israelis, I'd say all Israelis, speak some Hebrew. They learn it in school. I actually taught English there, and I won't actually testify to the level of English spoken by my students, because depending on the student, it's sometimes pretty sad, but sometimes quite good. And they actually all have to pass an exam in English before they can graduate high school. So don't worry, if none of this stuff sticks, you'll be fine. You can speak English, and they might have a bit of a broken English, but they should be able to understand you just fine and communicate with you as well. So, no stress when it comes to the Hebrew. This is really just for fun and to kind of try and get a sense of the culture a little bit better. So what I'd like to start with actually is just a bit of a short introduction to the history of the Hebrew language. I'm going to try and keep this pretty short. I'm not sure how much you guys know about Jewish history in general, about the history of Israel. I know that there's going to be some other people who will be addressing that, the history of Israel particularly, in greater detail. But I just want to kind of pick out the little highlights as they're relevant to the language, so you can have a bit more of an appreciation of the language that we're going to be speaking and kind of the culture that's grown up surrounding Hebrew. By the way, I tend to also talk quickly. If I'm talking too fast, please stop me. Don't wait for me. So basically, Hebrew is really what I'd like to call an old new language. It's a language that is very ancient, right? It dates back to over 3,000 years ago, which is a pretty long time. Before Jesus, before the state of Israel, obviously, and before most of the cultures that we're familiar with. However, it's also a very new language, and I want to kind of talk to you about some of the nuances in that. Basically, according to scholars, they believe that the language that became Hebrew started developing with the Phoenician culture, who lived on the, if you can imagine that map, so they're sort of on the Mediterranean coast. That's where the Phoenicians were in ancient times. And it developed from that, and also from some of the Assyrian languages, cuneiform, and those things, into a family of different languages. One of those is Hebrew. Another is Aramaic, and eventually Arabic a few hundred years later. So at that time, the Israelites, who were in what was then called Canaan, now what we call Israel, they spoke this language, and it was actually written originally in quite a different form of letters as we're going to learn today. And that form looked a lot like, again, some of those other languages, a little bit like Greek, a little bit about like Assyrian, some of those other languages. It looked quite different. Jews spoke that, they wrote in that. We've got coins that have that language on it, and some very old stone tablets and documents that have been found all over Israel, in Gezer, which is one of the archaeological sites there. But really that form of the alphabet fell out of favor when the Jews were exiled from the land of Israel with the Babylonians. So those of you who don't know so much of Jewish history, basically the Jewish people were living in then Canaan, They built the first, it's called the First Temple, which was on what's now the Temple Mount. The western wall, which you saw a picture of shortly before, was one of the retaining walls of the temple. That temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in about 586 BCE, or BC, and the Jews were sent to Babylonia. When they were in Babylonia, they carried their Hebrew language with them. However, they kind of adopted the Babylonian form of letters. And what they did when they eventually came back from that exile, back to Jerusalem and back to Israel, is they carried that letter form with them. They discarded the old-fashioned sort of Phoenician alphabet, and they instead wrote the same language, the same words, the same content, using this new alphabet. And that alphabet is actually the alphabet of modern Hebrew that we're going to learn. That alphabet kind of stuck for a while, for a very long time until the present day, and all continued nice and fine. You can find lots of the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, are written in this new alphabet. The scrolls of the Torah or the New Testament are written in that new alphabet. There are still some leftovers of the old alphabet that were used by maybe some more nationalist Jews who kind of wanted to keep the old forms of language. Overall, it was pretty universally adopted. And then what happened? Second temple was built after the return from Babylonia, and then it was destroyed again by the Romans. Jews got dispersed all over the world, to the Germanic countries, to Spain, and from there sort of all over the rest of the world, to places like America. And Jews stopped using Hebrew as their lingua franca. Instead, they retained it as an essential part of their culture, as basically a language of religion, of ritual, of prayer. And that, you know, is sort of carried through Jewish history, but it wasn't spoken as a Jewish language anymore. You can compare it a little bit to Latin. It's not quite as dead as Latin was, because people did use it regularly for prayer, you know, every day, and there was some use of the language, a little more than Latin, but for all intents and purposes, you know, they wouldn't be speaking it the way we're speaking English today. However, this sort of attachment to Hebrew continued because, if any of you have heard of Yiddish or Latino, what often happened is in these new countries where they found themselves, they would adopt some of the new language, let's say Spanish, and they would kind of mix it with remnants from the Hebrew. And they would often actually use, for example, in Yiddish, they would use the Hebrew alphabet to write out these sort of Spanish-sounding words. So even though the language Hebrew wasn't really spoken on daily basis in terms of, you know, the normal everyday life, there were still very strong remnants and influences of it. That's kind of the way things stayed for many, many years until the 19th century. In the 19th century, we have the birth of Zionism, or you could say the rebirth of Zionism. All these Jews started getting interested in going back to their old land of Judea, Israel, right? It had been about 2,000 years since this second exile, and there were a lot of things going on in the world. There was a rise of nationalisms in general, which got people thinking about, you know, how nice it is to have your own land. There was a lot of oppression in Russia, where many Jews lived. There were a lot of pogroms, which were basically like massacres of Jews. And people started thinking, like, this is not our place. You know, we want to go home. And where is home? That place we came from 2,000 years ago. So with the renewed interest in returning to sort of this old land of Israel came a renewed interest in Hebrew, and an interest in actually turning Hebrew, instead of just using it as kind of like this old relic that we use just for prayers and rituals, let's start talking it again, right? This is our national language, the way French is for the French, French is for the French people, and German is for the German people. And there were a bunch of scholars who kind of got together, some of the intelligentsia of the time, of the Jewish communities there, and they started kind of researching Hebrew and kind of looking more into its grammar and inventing new words and really trying to push for this renewed return to Hebrew as a Jewish language, in addition to a return to the land of Israel. Once they got to the land of Israel in the early 1900s, this really took off. Schools started being built, dictionaries were written, and the most famous person in this entire kind of historical movement, this renaissance of the modern Hebrew language, his name is Eliezer ben Yehuda. Now remember that name, Ben Yehuda, because you will find if you go to, I'm not sure about Haifa. Is there Ben Yehuda Street in Haifa? No. If you go to Tel Aviv, which you definitely should go to, and if you go to Jerusalem, which you definitely should go to, both of those places, top tourist spots, if you get a weekend off or something, you'll find some of the central streets, the most important streets in those cities, are actually named Ben Yehuda after this man, because he was just so influential in kind of this renaissance of the modern Hebrew language. So much so, there's kind of a crazy story about him, He was so devoted to Hebrew that at this time when nobody really spoke that much Hebrew, he actually had a son. And from the time that son was a baby, he refused to speak to him in anything but Hebrew. And remember, at this time, very few people spoke it as, an everyday language. They knew it like from prayers or, Bible study. And he refused to allow that child to have contact with anybody who did not speak Hebrew. There's a whole outcry, this is child abuse, what are you doing? But the interesting thing is, this child, who essentially became the first speaker, the first native speaker of modern Hebrew, he winded up fine, and in the course of kind of raising this child and trying to raise him only on Hebrew, Eliezer ben Yehuda had to kind of invent a whole bunch of new words. Because you know how kids are, like, Daddy, what's that? What's that? What's that? And there were names for all these things, right? 2,000, 3,000 years ago, there were no trains, and there were no planes, and there were no cameras, and there was no electricity. So what do you call that? What's that called? And what happened is, this is kind of this really dynamic step in the Hebrew language where they started inventing all of these new words. And that kind of continued till today. 1922, when Israel and Palestine was still under the control of the British, Hebrew was made an official language of Israel in addition to Arabic and English, which were at that time both considered official languages. And there it is to this day. This day, Hebrew is flourishing and flowering. There are rock bands who sing in in Hebrew, hip-hop songs in Hebrew, websites in Hebrew, people text in Hebrew, people on Facebook in Hebrew. It's language of business, of government, of commerce. Really, Israel is so thoroughly, it's such a natural language in Hebrew that it's actually pretty amazing if you think about the fact that 100 years ago, people didn't really speak it. So sorry, that was a bit longer introduction than I'd like to go, but I wanted to give you a bit of a background. So when you learn these things, really you're learning a language that's both ancient and very, very new. Okay, so are there any questions? No? Okay, time for YouTube videos? Perhaps. All right. The first thing I want to do, before I introduce you to the alphabet, can I just see, does anybody here know any Hebrew at all? Okay, I think I just get a little things up. So you're going to be my helper. And what's your name? Scott. Okay, so the first thing we're going to learn is we're going to learn how to introduce ourselves in Hebrew. So I'm going to teach you your very first word. Actually, your first word should be something else. Shalom. Do you guys know what that means? What does shalom mean? Hello. Goodbye. You're all right. And peace. Very important word. So that one word is like, you can use it a lot. It'll get you a lot of bang for your buck. So let's all say that together. Shalom. Shalom. Awesome. Now, some of you may speak Arabic. Does anyone here speak Arabic? You might know the Arabic word for peace, which is quite similar. It's salam. Salam. So shalom is the Hebrew, salam is the Arabic, and you can see the similarity between those two languages because they both sort of evolved from the same roots. Okay, so shalom is how we're going to introduce ourselves, and we're going to add to that I am, and then you're going to say your name. So the word for I am is very simple, ani. Ani. So let's all say that together. Ani. Awesome. So what you're going to do, we're going to go around, I'd like to go around the table, and we're all going to introduce ourselves. We're just going to say shalom, hello, ani, I am, and then your name. So I'll start. Shalom, ani, bani. And then you can all say shalom. 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 You guys are awesome. That was like super fast. You got that great. All right, so before we continue, I'm actually going to have you write your names down if you don't mind in English, but leave some room because you're going to write it in Hebrew too a little later, believe it or not. So let me give you some paper. We've got a pen. And if you wouldn't mind, just like fold it over so you can make a little sign on your desk. We'll save this for tomorrow as well. So I can try and get to know you a little bit better as we have our little post-show exercises. So I'll take them. And here's the pen. And you can just kind of fold it into threes. I think the best way to make it actually stay. Something like that.
So what do you write in here?
Just write your first name in English, but kind of leave room. Leave, I'd say, like half the length, so we can add also our names in Hebrew script, which we're going to do a little bit later. And now a YouTube video, as your reward for suffering through my long. Okay, this is in Hebrew. It's kind of cheesy. It's meant for kids, but I thought it was cute and short. So just to get you kind of introduced a little bit to the shape of the Hebrew letters and also just to the sound of the Hebrew language. Again, this is a childhood English language because the kids singing this are probably like 6-year-olds old. But in any case, a word that sounds very much like alphabet. Again, that's because the English language has maybe Greek influences to it, which in turn is related to Hebrew. So the alphabet in Hebrew is called the Aleph bet. And Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew language, of the Hebrew alphabet. Bet is the second one. So it's like calling the AB, leave off the C. Welcome to the alphabet. By the way, does anyone mind the connection between the colors on this fabulous PowerPoint presentation and the theme?
The national flag.
The national flag of Israel is blue and white, kachol v'levan. So just to get you in the spirit. Okay. Now, if you want to actually, you can follow along with the PowerPoint, but you also have this in the last page of your handout. You've got a little chart with the entire alphabet, the entire alphabet here, and it gives you all the names of the letters as well as the sounds that each of those letters make. And it also gives you at the bottom, you'll see there's a whole bunch of funny little dots and dashes. We'll get to those soon. But maybe keep this in front of you now. You're going to use it pretty soon to write your Hebrew name, or your name in Hebrew. And now let's go through the alphabet. So the very first letter we have in the alphabet is the Aleph. Looks kind of like a X almost, and this letter is actually silent. Next letter is Bet. Again, you can see kind of the resemblance to the ABC. It's a the sound.
Where are you from? Right from.
Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, very important point. Okay, Hebrew goes from right to left. It's the opposite of English. So all of you lefties out there, like, really sucks because like it's hard to write from left to right. I don't know if you have that problem. I'm a lefty, and I love writing in Hebrew because I don't get like ink on my hand. In any case, we're going from right to left. So, okay, thank you. So Bet is the next letter. Now this slide actually omitted something. In Hebrew, as I mentioned, there are a bunch of dots and dashes that are added to the basic shape of the letters to alter their sounds slightly. Some of those are not so important, some of those are more important. This letter over here actually has two different forms, okay? When it's just like this with nothing in the middle, it's called a vet, and it makes a V sound. Can everyone say vet? Okay, humor me, people, humor me. All right, now sometimes it has a little dot in the middle, which I couldn't bring up on the screen for some reason. When it has that little dot in the middle, which is called a dagesh, it makes a b sound, like bat. So this is the bet, also known as the bet. Next letter we have is called the gimel, and this makes a g sound, sort of a guttural. It's never pronounced like a j. So just, that's why, make sure you make a note of that. It should be pronounced g like get, okay? Not like j like giraffe. Our third funny little shaped letter here is called the dalet, and that makes a d sound, like dad. Let's all shout them out together. This next one's called a hey. Can everyone say hey? Hey. Hey, great. So it makes a h sound like an H, like hat. We've got the vav. Can you all say vav? Awesome. That is a v sound, like vet. Now this guy is also a little tricky. Sometimes it also has a dot on it, and it actually can have a dot in two places, which we might see a little later. You can have a dot right in the middle, which gives it a completely different sound, turns it into a vowel sound, the oo sound. You all say the oo. You all say ooh la la. That was just for fun. Okay. And sometimes it has a dot on top of it, and then it makes an O sound. Okay? But don't worry too much about that yet. If you're feeling scared of these letters, don't worry. We're not really going to read the actual Hebrew letters. I just want to kind of give you a bit of a sense of them. Maybe we'll read one word together, and then we'll turn to transliterations. This is the zayin. It makes a, can you say zayin? Great. It makes a z sound, like zoo. And now this is the doozy. This is basically like the holy grail of Israeli pronunciation. This is a challenge for all us Americans and non-native Hebrew speakers. This letter is called the chet. Now, historically, infamously mispronounced. And I will tell you some of those ways not to say these words. So how not to say this letter? Sometimes it's written as a CH. In your guide, I've written it as a KH, just so we don't have that problem, because you don't want to end up doing.
Doesn't want to have to be confronted with priorities and spending, because he has a lot of chutzpah.
Did you hear that? Let's hear that again.
Because he has a lot of chutzpah.
What's chutzpah? Does anyone know what she's trying to say?
Chutzpah.
Some good cuts going on. Chutzpah, yes, people, work it up. That's what I'm talking about. This is a guttural language. Don't be afraid to spit on your partner. So that, it's not chutzpah, it's chutzpah. Another way not to say this, sadly, from Adam Sandler, who should know better. Some of you may know the Hanukkah song. It's not really called Hanukkah.
I'm for Hanukkah, so not.
Let's hear that again. Not.
On your yarmulke, it's time for Hanukkah.
Actually, it's time for Hanukkah, not Hanukkah. But it's hard to say, so again.
Wait, what did you do?
He said Hanukkah. So a lot of people will call it that. In America, it's just hard for us to say the ch sound. It's not actually how you should pronounce it. This is actually how you should pronounce it. You may or may not have seen Hebrew Hammer. I'm not sure whether I'm actually recommending this movie, but for this intent and purpose.
Hanukkah will be no.
That's how to say the word. Let's hear that again.
Hanukkah will be no more.
So let's all hear a good ch sound again. Don't be shy, people. Get it out there. Get the spittle moving. Ch. Again. Ch. How about ha? Good. That's how Israelis laugh. Actually, they don't say ha ha ha. They say ha. I'm not kidding. That's really how they fake laugh. So let's try a few more words. How about hummus? Does anyone know what hummus is? Hummus, right. So hummus is not how Israelis pronounce it, it's how Americans pronounce it. But you can feel all cool and go to your ethnic grocery store and be like, I'll have some hummus, please. They'll be like, that's awesome. Okay, so practice that one. Once you've got that down, then you're well on your way to basically become a fluent Hebrew speaker. All right, so moving on from the chet, we have the tet. So tet makes a t sound, like tot. Next letter is yud. Now this guy's actually really small. I don't know if you can't really tell the scale compared to the other letters, but like most of the letters go from, let's say, the top to the bottom of the line. This one's kind of like half, even less than half. And this makes a y sound. This is also, let's say yud. Yud. So in Hebrew, there's no j sound. There's no native j sound, like J. So for example, when we say Jerusalem, Israelis don't call that city Jerusalem. They call it Yerushalayim, y, with the y sound. Judah, the name Judah in Hebrew is Yehuda. Okay? Jewish is Yehudi. Anything that's with a J in English is actually filling in for the y sound that we don't really use so much in English. Okay? So be aware that if you see people talking about Yerushalayim, don't be like, where is that? They're talking about Jerusalem. But they'll know what you're talking about if you see Jerusalem. So that's pretty good. Then we have the chaf, or the kaf. Now this is another one like that previous letter bet that often has a dot in it. When it's got a dot in it, it's a k sound, like a K. Now everyone say kaf. Kaf, good. Now when there's no dot in it, it makes a ch sound, our favorite word. So, you know, get excited with your phlegm again. Let's say chaf. 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 We had a chet, and this is a chaf. Good. You may be wondering why there are two letters that have the same sound. There's actually quite a few of those. The answer is probably that in ancient times there are probably some slight differences between those letters. Nowadays, some of those like nuances have been lost, so we sort of just pronounce them the same way. Okay. Lamed. This makes a l sound like lid. Mem. You say mem. Mem is like mom. This is a nun. You guys say nun? Awesome. So that's n like no. And this one looks kind of like an O. It's called a samech. Samech, we got that ch in there at the end of the word. And it makes a s sound, like C. Now here's another silent one, just like the very first letter. This is called an ayin, and it's actually silent. We'll talk about why it's there. We've got another one of these that has the dot in it. This is either a pay, you will say pay, or a fey. Fey. So it either makes a p sound or a f sound, again depending whether or not there is a dot in there. And we're almost in the alphabet, don't you worry. Only 22 letters, so you know, you get a discount on this one. Sadi. Okay, now this is another sound that we don't really have in English. It's a ts sound, like the end of hats. Okay, and it's quite common in Hebrew, so just kind of try that. Ts. Awesome. It's not a s and it's not a z. It's a ts. Good. Practice makes perfect. This is a kuf. Again, it makes another k sound. We had another letter earlier that made that sound as well. Reish. Yeah, let's all say reish. So it makes an R sound like ran, but really it's not really like ran. I can't really do it the right way. I'll show you some clips and hopefully we'll hear some real Israelis kind of pronouncing it. It's not quite like the Spanish R. It's not quite a rolled R, but it's definitely like it comes from your throat. It's a little different from like ro. Ro is kind of, it's like a bit blunter, and this one's a bit more like fabulous. Okay, then we have sheen. This is another one that can change sound depending on the dots around it. So you don't have this here. Sometimes there's a dot right in the left, well, for you guys, the right side of the letter. That would make it a sh sound. Sheen, let's say sheen. Sheen. Now if the dot is on this side, it turns the letter into an S sound, and the letter is called seen. Seen. It makes a s sound. Like another one that we already have, we have another letter that makes that same sound. And finally, our last letter is called the taf. Say that? Taf. And it makes a t sound like talk. Again, we had another letter that also makes a sound. So there you have it. Those are your letters. Believe it or not, if you do decide you're interested in Hebrew and you'd like to try and kind of learn how to actually read, it's really not that difficult once you kind of memorize those first letters. I taught a course this year. I had about 10 people, GA students who've never spoken a word of Hebrew, didn't know the letters at all. Within 6 weeks, they were reading full sentences. So it's really not as hard as it appears. It's just sort of like getting used to like the foreign look of the letters and learning. One other strange thing or different thing about the Hebrew language, a couple things actually. There are no capital, no uppercase, and lowercase letters. They're all the same, which kind of makes it easier in a way. So we just basically rely on punctuation marks. If there's a period, you know to stop, and the next word is the first word in the sentence. However, what they do kind of throw in there is there are some letters that actually change form if they appear as the very last letter of the word. And these letters are called sophit letters, which means final letters. And these are the final letters. And here you have the letter equivalent. So this is a mem, which made the sound. If this letter appears at the beginning or somewhere in the middle of a word, it looks like a top. If it appears as the last letter in a word, it changes form and looks like this. This is the huff, same thing. If it's in the beginning or middle of the word, it looks like this. If it comes as the last letter, we switch it over to this guy, and so on. So that's one added little complexity in Hebrew. Another thing in Hebrew is just like in English how we have cursive writing. So in Hebrew, there's also this sort of cursive. It's quite difficult to make those kind of like big square letters. It's kind of awkward to write them. So in general, when Israelis write, they actually write using slightly conformed letters. This is called script, and you can see maybe some similarities. Like the bet is a little bit similar. Instead of just having like a line, it kind of curves up a little bit along it. There's some similarities, but some of them do look quite different. This is something you guys don't need to worry about. But if you see a bunch of people writing stuff and you're like, those aren't the letters I learned with Bonnie, then that's why they're writing it in script. And the final kind of strange thing about Hebrew is, if you notice, there are no actual vowels in the actual alphabet, Instead of having letters that act as vowels, there's a system of funny dots and dashes that act as the vowels. And depending on where those dots and dashes are placed, below the letter, above the letter, to the side of the letter, that dictates the vowel sound that's going to be attached to that letter. So these are some of the Hebrew vowels. We have the one that kind of looks like a plus sign or a cross is called the kamatz. It makes an ah sound. The patah next with that line here also makes an ah sound. Sere and segol both make an eh sound. This is often silent. This is an o. You might remember the vav with the dot on top that we had a little bit before. This is an e. This is an oo. Another oo. This is an o. Ah. Eh. So there are all these different ones, and when they're combined with letters, we get consonants and vowels. So this is an example now. Remember we had a couple letters that were silent. I remember that the very first one, aleph, and then there's one later, ayin. So this is what happens when a silent letter is combined with the dots and dashes, or the nikud, as they're called in Hebrew. So this line here makes an ah sound. So since this letter aleph doesn't have a sound of its own, it completely takes on this sound. So we would read this syllable or this letter combination as ah. This one too, ah. Now this one, these two dots make an eh sound. Combined with the aleph, which has no sound, we just go completely by the vowel sound, so that's also an eh. This, for example, is an e, an o, an u. But if, say, you had a different letter, one that actually does have a sound, that's like a bet, that makes a b sound, and if you had that very same, if you had that very same like line that makes the ah sound under the b sound, you would get ba, because it's the ah added to the consonant ba, ba. And through that combination of vowels and letters, that's how you create words. So that is your very brief introduction to the alphabet.